Katherine Ozment is an award-winning journalist and the author of Grace Without God, The Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Belonging in a Secular Age. And we read an interview with her in the Chicago Tribune over the summer and thought, wow, that is someone we need to hear. We want to hear what she has to say. She's worked in publishing for more than 25 years, including as a senior editor for National Geographic, for which she once rode a donkey through the desert of Jordan and Israel on assignment. And I totally want to ask her about that during coffee hour. Her personal essays and reported articles have been widely published, including articles in National Geographic, the New York Times, Boston, Salon, and Fitness. She was born in Arkansas, graduated from Harvard College with a degree in English and American literature, and received her master's in writing from DePaul University here in Chicago. She has lived on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and now she's here in Chicago with her husband, who is an environmental economist at the University of Chicago, and their 3 children. Join me in welcoming Katherine Ozment.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. You guys have been at secular community for a lot longer than I've been writing this book. So I just want to say I hope, especially during Q&A, we can have a true exchange of ideas. I love seeing already in action so much of what I was searching for as I set out to write this book, and so much of what I know other people are searching for. So I want to tell today the story of religious loss in this country. There's a lot of numbers involved that are pretty dramatic. This is a real thing that is happening. And then get into sort of the purpose of my book, which was to help people find replacements for some of what they missed. So I thought there was no better way to start this story than with a story about my grandmother, because this is really a generational change. It's something that's happening from one generation to the next. And there was truly no one I knew more religious than my grandmother. And so I'm going to start with a very short reading, and then I'll get into the talk. When my grandfather Edgar died at the age of 52 after a brief treatment for leukemia, my grandmother spent a long night driving the 375 miles home to Arkansas from the hospital in Temple, Texas, with her eldest son. She was known to everyone, including her grandchildren, as Susie, and she was the most religious person I ever knew. Susie had deep brown eyes and a poof of white hair that circled her high, wide forehead like a cloud. She was smart and funny and independent, a columnist for the town newspaper, a writer of short stories and poetry, and the first woman to run for public office in the state of Arkansas, where she lived her whole life. But it was her devout faith that most defined her. She played piano and served as an elder in the First Presbyterian Church in downtown Camden, a city of 11,000 not far from the Texas border. She said grace before meals and read the Bible before bed. For a time, she even worked as a missionary, traveling to British Guiana with her Bible, her sketchbook, and her straw hat. She and Edgar raised their 4 children to attend church every Sunday and then some. It was past midnight when she crossed the Arkansas border, and she drove the final stretch home with dread. Her teenage children would be sleeping in the quiet house, and she felt a growing unease about re-entering her darkened home without Edgar. But as she turned her Chevrolet onto her tree-lined street, she noticed something strange. All the windows of her house were lit, and there were people standing out in the yard and on the street. She thought she was imagining them, but pulling up to the house, she saw scores of people she knew from church and from town, standing outside in the middle of the night as if attending a Sunday church potluck. Up the front steps and winding through the rooms of her house, people were gathered to welcome her and ease her grief. I can only imagine the feeling of comfort she had when she saw them all. Later, she said of the experience, "It was the moment I knew what it meant to be a survivor." In dark moments, I sometimes worry about what would happen to my children and me if we were in a similar situation. What belief system would ground us? What spiritual guide would give us answers? Who would come to comfort us, and how long would they stay? As I began to write this book, I wanted to know when my family began to lose its ties to religion. How in the space of just 2 generations did we go from my grandmother's experience of religious identity and support to my standing alone at a window telling my son we were nothing? And I want to reference that earlier in the prologue to the book. I talk about a moment 5 years ago when my son and I were at the window at our house. It was late on a Friday night, probably about 10 o'clock, and we'd heard some strange noise. And we went to the window, and coming up this street adjacent to our house were about 100 people holding candles. They were dressed in nice clothes, all generations. There was, preceding them, this chariot-like structure draped in fresh flowers, and as it moved and sort of stopped and right in front of our window, I could see there was a little doll wrapped in white inside of it. There was a priest with a flat-topped hat and a robe, and he read from a book, and the congregation read back and forth for a few minutes as my son and I watched. And then they proceeded up the street and into the Greek Orthodox Church, which was right on the corner where we lived, and closed the doors. And my son turned to me after that scene and said, "What was that?" And I said, I think it's Good Friday, and that's how the Greek Orthodox congregation marks this time of year and this holiday with this ritual. And he said, "Well, why don't we do that?" And I said, "Because we're not Greek Orthodox." And he pressed me and he said, "Well, what are we?" And I just blurted out, "We're nothing." And of course, I had been raised not as religiously as my grandmother or my mother, but as a Christian. I was raised Presbyterian. And my husband had been raised Jewish in Hyde Park. His family was part of the synagogue. They weren't super religious, but the synagogue was a big part of their identity. And his father went to Torah study. My husband and his brother were both bar mitzvahed. And when we got married, we thought we'd find something, a way to raise our kids in some kind of community that worked for both of us. And clearly, my son was 9 years old. We had spent 9 years not finding that and not really doing that. And that was the moment where this sort of nagging sense that had been sort of bugging me, and I think also bugging my husband, we would talk about it sometimes, sort of came to a head. And I realized as my son went upstairs to bed that I had to do better than that. I needed to come up with a way to articulate my worldview. I needed to be able to share with him and his 2 sisters what I valued and believed. They were always asking questions. What happens when we die? Why are we here? Who were the first people? My daughter would ask, who were the parents of the first people? And so if you don't have it, if you haven't figured out how to articulate it to yourself, you can't articulate it to your kids. And so at the time, I worked as a contributing editor to Boston Magazine. And whenever I had a problem like this, I pitched it as a story idea to my editor. And I said, "I think I should write a story about people raising kids without religion." And he said, "Well, that describes me too, and a lot of people I know. So yeah, let's go for it. Let's do an article about this." It would weave personal stories with some of the social science research and sort of look at the statistics. How common is this? And I thought it was somewhat small, actually. I thought it would be a smaller group. Religion has been dominant in this country for so long that I thought I might have a hard time finding people like me. And this was in 2012. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but in 2012, in October, the Pew Foundation came out with some really startling numbers about religion in this country. It made all the headlines, and everyone on NPR was talking about it nonstop. And it was that 20% of Americans describe themselves as religiously unaffiliated, and fully 30% of millennials, those who are between 18 and about 30. And this was really a startling figure, because for as long as people had measured religious disaffiliation, that number had hovered at 5 or 6%. And so I realized that my story was really a lot bigger than me and my editor and the few people that we knew. It was happening to 1 in 5 people in this country had left their religious sort of identifying name or tribe. They call these people the nuns because they essentially check none of the above on the questionnaire. So instead of coming up with new terminology, they kind of just plunk everyone who's unaffiliated under this nun umbrella. It includes atheists, agnostics, ethical humanists, secular humanists, free thinkers, skeptics, spiritual but not religious. It's kind of a big, messy tent under which all of these people fall because they don't match up with the traditional labels. And so I wanted to understand why this was happening. And so I called Bob Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone and American Grace. He's since written a book called Our Kids. And he studies the breakdown of civic and religious connections in society. And this is something that's very dear to his heart. So I knew he'd have thoughts about this. But I didn't really know how surprised he would be by those figures. I figured someone who is so close to this research would certainly know that 20% of people, that's going to be coming out one of these days. He was utterly shocked. He said, you cannot overestimate the importance of that study and what it says about our society and how it's being remade. And he described the graph itself as a hockey stick. He said, for as long as anyone knew, it was 5 or 6% of unaffiliated. And starting at about 1990, which it turns out was when I graduated from college, it starts to go up. So it looks like a hockey stick. It's now really going up. So now it's starting to look more like a boomerang, I think. Just about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, the Public Religion Research Institute came out with updated figures. So this is 4 years later. 25% of Americans are unaffiliated, 39% of millennials. So you can see that as the generations are going along, they're losing that connection to religion. Back in 2012, I asked Bob Putnam, why do you think this is happening? And he said, people, this is his theory, and a lot of people share it. In the 1960s, we had the counterculture, which called into question many of our mores, our affiliation with institutions, our allegiance to institutions. And there was this giant shakeup. And in reaction to that, we saw the moral majority and Jerry Falwell come along and say, well, that's not right. We got to, keep things the way they were. And it was that moment when suddenly politics entered the pulpit and people started talking about so-called family values. I mean, I remember people questioning whether women should work outside the home, but other things, gay and lesbian rights, women's reproductive rights, things like that, started entering what had been a sacred religious space. People started leaving the pews. So that's one popular theory. Now, these new numbers that came out about 2 weeks ago, they actually asked people, why did you leave? And they gave them a series of answers. And this isn't a perfect way to do it because they probably have other answers that weren't on that list. But when given a bunch of options, the number one choice people chose, about 60% of respondents, first said, I left religion because I no longer believe religious teachings. The second one was I wasn't raised with much religion, so I just didn't feel attached to it. And the third one was I disagree with the church's teachings on gay and lesbian rights. So you can see a really big shift, especially among the millennials. 39% of millennials disaffiliating. They are the most open to LGBT rights among all generations. They really, it doesn't bother them. They think it's, anyone judging people based on that, they can't stomach that. So they can't go into a church where that kind of thing is going to be discussed. And so we see here that there is this sort of larger thing happening, I think even bigger than what Putnam was talking about. And for many years, people have talked about a secularization thesis, which states that as places modernize, religion will fall out of favor because it will get crowded out by other concerns. People will have their existential needs met in a variety of ways through civic institutions, and they won't need religion as much anymore. And people have always said, I think including Bob Putnam, that can't be true, because look at America. In America, you have the most modern country on earth, and it's so religious. So this was always held up as a counterexample, disproving the secularization thesis. Well, now with these new numbers, people are starting to, in fact, there was a research paper that I write about in my book that states that, in fact, the U.S. is no longer that counterexample. We are now an example. We now can show that generations, from generation to generation, people are losing the components of religiosity, which are belief, behavior, and belonging. And those are weakening. Those ties are weakening with each generation. We see it really pronounced, in a pronounced way, with the millennials. And so this is sort of this landscape on which we find ourselves, and in which I found myself telling my child we were nothing. I realized I was really caught up in these huge, huge cultural forces. So I published my article in January of 2013, and I went around and gave some talks about it. And at one of the talks, a father raised his hand, and he said, I understand why people are leaving religion. This is why I left it. This is why my wife left it. But I have a child, and we don't know where to go. His life is about Minecraft and soccer games and schoolwork. And our lives are about running around to get the errands done and doing our workaday lives. And where do we go to find a values-based community that shares what we believe in? Where do we go to find a quiet time where we turn off our devices and we don't, get caught up in the modern day and all of our busyness and our digital distractions? And I realized I had written a whole article about the so-called problem, but I hadn't really given many solutions. I hadn't found them. It was a 4,000-word article, so that would have been a lot to include. But that's how the book began. It began with that man's question, and ultimately with my son's question, which is, how do we, once we've left, find the things that religion has done a pretty good job of giving people throughout time? So a sense of belonging and identity and community, those are really tied together. But also rituals that create meaning and a sense of overall meaning and purpose. Believing that you are part of God's plan is a really remarkable way to give yourself a sense of meaning, that you're part of this larger thing. So I went searching for secular alternatives. I spent 3 years traveling around the country, talking to people like groups like this and others, individuals, families, and trying to find where people were experiencing and enacting what I call grace without God. And one of the things I try to do in the book is remove some of this language of profound human experience from the religious realm and give it back to secular people. And so we can find, we have experiences, and I'll talk about it in a minute, of spirituality that has nothing to do with God or some energy beyond what we can see. And so I wanted to just talk about three things that I found particularly interesting that really changed my experience and gave my life a greater sense of meaning. And the first one is story. And I came to realize that the religious have this profound sort of, like an archive. They have these stories that get passed down through generations that they can call on. And the importance of the stories isn't really necessarily whether they're literally true or not. It's what they represent and what they mean to the people in terms of what they value. So that, a story of persecution can come to mean that you are someone who fights for social justice. And so how are these religious stories passed down? I interviewed another professor at Harvard named Marshall Gans. And Gans was raised Jewish, and he spent a lot of time working in civil rights movement. He worked for the United Farm Workers of America, and he even worked in the Barack Obama 2008 campaign. And what he said was, he wasn't even all that religious, but he learned from Judaism how important having a narrative was to motivate people, to galvanize action. He now teaches a public narrative course at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he asks the students to come up with a story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. And of course, we all have a story of self. He wants them to articulate it. But it's what do we value, and where do those values come from? For him, it was from his Jewish background. His father was a rabbi. He grew up hearing the stories. How do we connect our story of self to others, to create a story of us, whether it's in a group like this, whether it's in a family, whether it's in a school community, or in a neighborhood. I live in Hyde Park, and I think it has a really strong story of us that I wasn't really aware of until I started doing this research. And then the story of now is where you take that story to meet some challenge of today and galvanize people to moral action. And that was the really key component, that without these stories, which religion has long done, how do you motivate people into action? So religions are very motivating. And you can see this just as an aside in our elections. The religious are far more likely to vote than the non-religious. In fact, the nuns vote at half the rate as evangelical Protestants. So something to think about next month. But I started thinking, okay, well, but I don't have that. I don't have that religious community. Where can I talk about and learn about story and see an example of story connecting people? And I found a storytelling community in Ashland, Oregon, and I went to visit them. And there, a man named Mark Yaconelli, he's a minister, but he's created this entirely secular storytelling community. And his problem, the story of now that he wanted to address, the crisis that he wanted to fix, he felt like no one in his town knew their neighbors. And they didn't really care about their neighbors. And if you needed eggs or some flour, you didn't even know who to ask because you didn't know if anyone would be home. And the kids weren't really out playing in the neighborhood anymore. They were off in their sort of organized extracurricular sports. So he created a town storytelling community. It meets 4 times a year, and then they have smaller satellite groups that meet throughout the year. And basically what it is he has about 8 people, non-professionals, people from the community, come up and share a story based on a theme. And they stand before about 400 people. They had to keep getting a bigger and bigger venue because they couldn't fit everyone. They now meet in the synagogue because that's the biggest place in town. And the people share their story. And the idea is that by the others listening and by the Mark, who kind of leads and guides everyone through and sort of wraps everything together really nicely, that people will sort of have this greater feeling of compassion, this feeling of a story of us in this town. We've got each other's backs. Last year, there was a mass shooting at a community college near them, at Umpqua Community College. You may remember this in Oregon. Many people died. And he's brought his storytelling community there so that people can share their stories and, again, connect to what is good about us and what is the thing that we can give to the world in this way. And so that was one aspect, one community I met that I thought was doing really important work. Another element of this research that something that I hadn't thought about in great detail since leaving religion was the importance of ritual. And a lot of people think of ritual as tired and rote and just going through the motions. I hear this a lot, especially from former Catholics. Oh, I just can't do another ritual. And a lot of secular Jews complain about the high holidays. Oh gosh, what are they saying? And I don't understand it. And do I have to take the kids? And so I wanted to find out, really, is that really all ritual is? Because it seemed to me there was more to ritual than that. And I interviewed a professor at Harvard. At the time, I was living in Boston, so I just kept getting on the T and going to Harvard to interview these guys. And I found a guy named Michael Puett, who is a Chinese philosopher. He actually has a new book out called The Path that you might be interested in if Chinese philosophy is your thing. And he said, his view of ritual was that it actually can be a really meaningful thing that allows us to expand into new dimensions of ourselves and even create a more harmonious relationship with others. And he used Chinese monarchs as an example. He said, back in the days when maybe a monarch had died or fallen ill, and there was a lot of gossip and infighting, and maybe someone was going to kill someone to try to become the new monarch, there was always a ritual, and the ritual was in place, and that was just the way they did things. And during the ritual, the new monarch and maybe the brother of the old monarch or whoever that person's right-hand person had been would stand with the others in a ceremonial space And they would align themselves with the celestial bodies, with planets. And they did this to show that they were in harmony. And the idea was that they walked onto a stage and they put aside all that was sort of going on in the background, that sort of messy, our human pettiness, and they enacted something that showed harmony and maybe helped them to see what things could be in a more perfect version. So I went looking for this. I went looking for a secular ritual that showed this. And I went out to California, to Northern California, and I found a nature-based coming-of-age program where the kids who are about to, the age of a typical bar or bat mitzvah or confirmation, they go through a year-long, completely secular process on a farm. They meet once a month. They work on talking and exploring different values, and they work the land, and they are out in nature with one another. And at the end, there's a ceremony, and I attended the ceremony with them. And it was exactly what Michael Puett was talking about. The youngsters, there were probably 20 of them, filed into the room, and each took turns, and the parent would stand up and say something about the child, what the child had meant to them, what the child had taught them, what they hope for the child as they go out, and become adults. And then the child would say one thing about themselves that is their gift or their true talent, and one thing they hope to give to the world with that gift. To me, this was really amazing. I have an adolescent. I have a 13-year-old. I don't know that I've ever asked him, what are you going to give to the world? Here was a ritual that was forcing everyone into that spot, whether it's comfortable or not. And these parents who are making themselves very vulnerable. There was one girl in particular that I write about in the book. She was adopted from Nepal. And her mother wrote about how they had been through earthquakes and over mountains, and they had gone through a lot of difficulty in their relationship, but they had somehow survived, and they were better for it. And the girl, Lakba, said that her gift to the world was her sense of humor and her kindness. And so at the end of the ceremony, the mentors then give each child a new name. And her name that she was given was Mountain Humor. And so I really liked that. Again, my son had asked, what are we? And I had said nothing. Here's an example of sort of crafting an identity based on who you really are, what your values are, what your gifts are. And it was a ritual that asked people to stand on stage and be a version of their most perfect selves. And it was really lovely. And then the last thing I want to talk about, which perhaps is the biggest conflict for me in leaving religion, and this predated having kids, was this loss of a belief in God, in a sense that sort of fell down to earth when that happened. And it was hard for me to find true meaning and purpose. And so I started digging into sort of how do we feel meaning? And for the religious, it's obvious that if you believe in God and you believe you're part of that divine plan, that's an extraordinary way of thinking about yourself and the earth and how things work. And part of that is this feeling of awe, this feeling of being awed by this powerful, supreme being who is working these wonders behind the scenes and has put us all here. And we may not know exactly why, but he has. And so I started looking at the science of awe, which it turns out is this burgeoning new field. I found a researcher named Dr. Kelter out at UC Berkeley, and he divided up a group of subjects to find out what effect awe really has on us in terms of how we feel about ourselves. He asked them to answer a series of questions in a journal, and the main question was, who are you? And he put half the students in a hallway, and without really explaining that he was doing this, he put the other half in the Natural Sciences building, sitting next to a giant statue of Tyrannosaurus Rex. And when he got the questions back, sure enough, the students in the hallway had answered the question, who are you, by saying, I'm a student, I'm a soccer player, I'm a brother. The students who were sitting next to Tyrannosaurus Rex said, I am a member of the human species. I am an organic form. I am part of the cosmos. There was this way in which it wasn't just that awe makes us feel small, but it makes us feel connected. And I think that's some of what the religious get from thinking God is everywhere, is that we are connected to all of this. And when we lose that, how can we experience that? Well, luckily, we can feel awe in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to come from a religious source. And so I went to another researcher, a woman at Arizona State University named Michelle Chioda, and I said, you know, I often feel the most awe when I'm putting my youngest child to bed. And I'm rubbing her back, and I'm seeing her skin so smooth and her hair, and I just can't believe she exists. I just am amazed by this, that we're all here, you know, and that it really, really hits home then. And I said, but I'm not standing at the Grand Canyon, and I'm not standing at the ocean, and how is this that is awe? And she said, because it's you connecting to a system. And so once I had that sense of being in awe, feeling wonder is from feeling a part of a system, even if it's the circle of life on a smaller scale, looking at a child. I started to notice I was having it a lot. I was having it more. And so putting that language to it. In fact, she said spirituality, which is a word I've never really liked. It's always struck me as so woo-woo and kind of vague, and people throw it around, and I never know what it means. She said, well, think about it this way. Think about spirituality as feeling that connection. And it doesn't have to be with something invisible. It can be with nature. It can be with the earth. And so that was really eye-opening for me. And that, for me, those three things, in addition to, you know, I didn't talk as much about community because I kind of feel like you guys have that figured out. But those elements, along with the others that I talk about in the book, are what have given me, really, after these several years of research, much more deeply connected feeling in my life and a greater sense of meaning. And so I wanted to close with another short reading before questions and answers. And in this one, at the end of the book, about 5 years after I told my son he was nothing, I wrote him and his sisters a letter. And in the letter, I try to articulate what I was so inarticulate about that day. Not just what we are, but really what I value and what I believe. And I'm just going to read the first 5 items. There's a list of 10. Someone called it my 10 commandments. But I don't really see it that way. It's sort of more like suggestions. So here is just the first 5 items on my list, and then I'll be happy to take any questions. 1, your life is a privilege. Live it well and seek to help others live well too. 2, find your people. Find friends who share your values, though not necessarily your beliefs. Welcome people of all faiths and no faith at all into your life. Grace comes in many forms, colors, and creeds, with and without God, and connecting to others is one of our greatest sources of meaning. 3, learn the religious stories. You don't have to believe them, but they are a part of your heritage and history, whether you embrace religion or not. Be curious about them. Figure out what they may have meant to your ancestors and what they mean to people today. See if the values they embody apply to your life in some way. 4, study the rich history of non-belief. Learn about the doubters and atheists and secular humanists who have likewise shaped our world, often at their peril. They too are part of your heritage. And lastly, open yourself to awe and wonder. Visit art museums, walk through nature, read great poetry. Pay attention to the mundane. Notice the cracks in the sidewalk, the green of the leaves. Marvel at the full harvest moon low in the autumn sky. The 2-week-old baby in her mother's arms, the bursts of playground laughter piercing the air across the street. Don't get so busy that you forget that we are all living in a mystery. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Believe in the religious story. Learn religious story, but you don't have to believe in them.
Right.
Okay. The Epic of Gilgamesh, it is the oldest written document in the history of humankind. Okay. 11 tablets. Tablet 11, it's about the deluge and the flood. Autonabishtim and the flood and the whole thing. Okay? This is my question. Yes. In the book of Genesis, we have the same story. They're both identical, but the deluge in the Epic of Gilgamesh is 1,000 years older than the Bible, the story in the Bible. Which one you believe? Or do you think it is, I don't know.
So I don't believe any of the stories in the Bible. But I believe they are metaphors.
It is documented?
I believe that the Bible, in all the sacred texts, were written by humans at a time. It's hard for us to know exactly, the authenticity of the stories and such. So, for example, I don't believe Jesus performed miracles, things like that. But, in terms of the flood, I will say a funny story. I tried at one point, because I do think religious literacy is very important for kids, and I tried at one point to get my daughter to read some Bible stories, and I bought this children's Bible that all my sort of lefty liberal friends recommended, and we started reading, and I thought, we'll start with Noah's flood. It was just kind of popped into mind with the ark and the cute little animals. And gosh, after about a first paragraph, she was in tears and said, "I don't want to read this anymore. God is too mean." And so we closed the book, and we turned. It was funny though, because she wanted to read instead the Greek myths. But the Greek myths are pretty terrifying too. But there's not this sense of this supreme being who can just take you on a whim. There's a little bit more of a sort of a variety of people. And so I think it gets to that question of awe and the sort of awe-inspiring God that she was really rejecting. So we haven't gone back to the Bible since, but maybe eventually.
Another question here?
Going back to your discussion about the nuns, and particularly with millennials deciding to really leave religious institutions because of the teachings, particularly when it comes to the treatment of gays and lesbians. And the missing link that I find in that is because a lot of the nuns still believe in God. Right. And in your research, have you ever come across any specific reasons why, for example, people are leaving the church even though they still believe in God, mainly because of, reasons of treatment of gays and lesbians, but also because they don't, I don't know how to put this, but there are other church organizations out there, such as the Episcopalian Church, which named its first gay bishop. You've got United Church of Christ, which is very progressive. Why are they leaving religion altogether, religious institutions, and not finding other more evolved institutions where they're not, they're ignoring certain aspects of the Bible, which a lot of us non-theists would call cherry picking the Bible, but instead just leaving religion altogether and not finding more openly progressive churches.
Right. I think that's a really good question. I completely understand. And I think that part of it is, again, the secularization not only allows for more ideas to come out there, but with the internet, I think more and more people, young people especially, are finding other ideas. And they're finding examples of, bad things that the clergy have done, say, or there was the Catholic priest scandal and things like this. And they're also finding a lot of support for atheism online. A lot of them go on YouTube or they're on Reddit and they're hashing out these ideas and they're realizing, it's not just me who doubts some of these religious precepts. There's a lot of people out there. And it's almost like a growing acceptance of that and sort of we don't have to be religious to find meaning. And so, one thing I asked Bob Putnam, what's the answer? Is there going to be some resurgence of a Unitarian church, for example? Are people going to just start flocking there instead because they pretty much accept everyone? And he said, the problem with that is it has a very specific brand, if you think about it, as something on the marketplace. And people have already made up their minds about that brand. And it's hard for them to change their feelings about the brand. It's kind of, that's what the Unitarians do, and I've never been a part of that. And so he said it might have to be something new. And I said, I've been sort of doing a lot of research on these secular humanist communities, much newer than this one, Sunday Assembly and the Oasis Network and various humanist communities at universities. I said, is that the answer? And he said, well, maybe, but we won't know for 300 years. So I think your question is a good one, and it's really hard to answer. I think it's hard to know what people will gravitate to. Yeah.
I forgot to mention for folks in the balcony, I won't be able to make it up to you. So if you have a question, please come down to the bottom of the stairs, and I'll be sure to come over and find you there if you've got a question. Who else? I'll get you, and then you.
Question is about science education and integration with social studies in the early schooling and high school. That's lacking because they don't integrate today's science, which is itself creates awe, considering our position in the universe and how much we know. Last just 100 years, considering life is 3.5 billion years old. Life, humans are early humans are 2 million, but only we're 250,000 years. We must be having awe, but however, the real facts, concepts, which are already 20th century concepts, are not integrated to at least to my knowledge, unless there is change going on nowadays in the schools. We are still fighting, school boards are fighting about whether Darwin is a scientific theory or not. Is that the reason why younger generation is not quite free in a free society like ours? And whereas China and Russia, they were forced to become atheist in the beginning, even though they have now freedom to go to church. On the other hand, we're supposed to respect here greatly humans, regardless how strange their faith is. We do follow that, but however, we are not going ahead in this thing. That means somebody is obstructing. We are not following our things. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to science education in this country. I can say that research shows, and I interviewed a psychologist who'd done some research on this, and it's really interesting, the atheist brain versus the religious brain. There is a sort of a way that you can see some differences, and her research looked at sort of a spectrum of belief, and how we're all on the spectrum, but some of us are more likely to be atheists than believers. And one of the theories is that once kids start to get some science education, all kids start out as believers. My daughter believes in God, and she has imaginary friends that she talks to a lot, and there's this desire in the brain, especially at a younger age, to want to assign design thinking to inanimate objects even. And so kids want to believe in a God. And once they start to learn some science in around 12 and 13 years old, they start to see, we have to piece this problem apart by looking at sort of cause and effect and consequences. And then you see that they stop answering questionnaires by a scientist like this with belief answers. They're more looking at it as an atheist. And there's this new research that came out 2 weeks ago. It said, when did you lose religion? And most of the people said before 18 years old. And I wondered if there was some connection to that. But in terms of, yes, I think religious ideas about evolution are obviously a problem in this country. We do have 25% unaffiliated. We still have 75% affiliated. We are still a very religious country, and the world is still a very religious world. And I think that just takes some time and evolution of its own. Yeah.
People use religion as a way of finding meaning in life, but they also use it as a way of finding meaning in death. And I'm wondering what your experience or your research tells us about how atheists deal with that problem.
Yeah, so I have a chapter on death in this book, and I write in particular about death rituals and the rise of secular humanist chaplains and celebrants who can walk people through a funeral without saying your loved one has gone to a better place. But one of my favorite interviews was with Lawrence Krauss. Some of you may know him. He's a very well-known atheist and cosmologist, and he talked about how death actually gives life meaning. The fact that we end and we really end means that this is all there is, and I think I heard this from many of the atheists I interviewed and other people who don't believe in an afterlife, is that knowing that there is a bookend at either end of our lives means that we've really got to fill that middle part with something, and we've got to do our best while we're here because there's nothing to wait for. So I think, broadly speaking, that was really the take that I got most. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to follow up on the question of the gentleman about why do people who leave a church because of the social issues not just gravitate towards one that's more open to their way of thinking. And my little theory is that perhaps it's because they've lost their belief in God. Yeah. But it's so socially unacceptable to say that, especially if you're an elected official running for re-election or a judge or a CEO or anybody in the public light, where that would be taken as the equivalent of not having any morality, right? Yeah. So is there any research, whether it's more anonymous studies or any other kind of research that would show that maybe these people who are leaving the church because they can't abide by the pre-scandal or the LGBT stuff really just plain don't believe anymore?
So there's research related to that, which is that people lie on these surveys all the time. And they claim that they're going to church way more often than they actually are. And so I think that's related. And part of that is because atheists are among the most hated groups in this country and distrusted. I think recently Muslims sort of became the least favorite group, but they're neck and neck with the atheists. And so it's hard to come out as an atheist or tell people you don't believe in God. That, I think, is changing. I think especially among the millennials, and in some groups, you wouldn't want to come out as a believer, right? Because that's the norm. But I think as more and more people find their voice on these issues and come out and say, we don't eat babies, but we also don't believe in God, that people will see. I compare it to the gay rights movement, and that, not that long ago, people were against gay marriage, and now it's the law of the land. And I feel like something similar is going to happen for non-believers.
Hi. So I grew up as a nothing, and I found my way here because I felt like it was hard to grow up in America being nothing. So I'm curious whether after your sort of work in this area, have you brought like deliberate structure or practice or anything to your own family to sort of change that being a nothing?
Yeah, so we did, and we moved to Chicago 2 years ago. But before that, I was very involved in the humanist community at Harvard. And I would take my kids there, very similar to this, actually. They have a thriving children's program, and I would take them to lots of community service events, and I would go to their Sunday programs. And when we moved here, there wasn't anything where I live in Hyde Park necessarily. I think this would probably be the closest match. But I have come to feel that my neighborhood is our people. And it shares our values. And what's really interesting is I live in a really kind of, there's a lot of religious institutions where I live. I live around the corner from like 3 churches all in a row, and there's a Buddhist group, and there's seminaries, and there's all this stuff. And yet there seems this undergirding in Hyde Park and other communities of secular humanism and of, a belief in science and all of that, so that we're all kind of existing together in our difference because we have this shared belief in helping others, and community service has a long history in Hyde Park, and diversity and issues like that. And so I feel like in a way I found that kind of a structure for my kids. I feel like I'm raising them in a place where I can reinforce that. And so one of the things we do is we're involved in the neighborhood club, which does a lot of work for underserved families in Chicago. They provide after-school tutoring and mentoring and things like that. And so we're pretty heavily involved in fundraising and activities, community service for them. So,
All the way over on this side for a change.
Wouldn't it be more accurate to say that the stories in the Bible are exaggerations rather than outright lies? For example, it's very possible that a group of indentured servants, not slaves really, escaped from Egypt under the leadership of Moses, which suspiciously sounds like a shortened Egyptian name, and that we know now that the Jewish community in Israel was very, the lower classes anyway, expected the coming of the Messiah. So rather than saying that they're outright lies, we could say that they're exaggerations.
Yeah, or metaphors, exaggerations. Yeah, I think that. Yeah.
Okay, here's another question.
Hi, you spoke very briefly on the political people that are religious vote with greater frequency than people that are not. I wonder if you can expand upon that as it pertains to personal motivation. My mother is extremely religious and conservative, and she is an activist against abortion, and that is, and she believes that is like her dictate from God to. And it's pervasive, throughout her entire life, and that's her main thing. And I think that's something that we who are not believers, that's something that we lack, and that's something that I struggle with myself, because there are many issues that are very personal and important to me, but I often find myself lacking that same vigor.
Yeah. No, God is a very powerful being, and I think it galvanizes people, just as you said. It's that story of us meeting the story of now. I mean, if you really believe that people are killing babies when they use birth control then that's really going to motivate you to get to the polls and try to prevent someone from putting some Supreme Court judges on who will support and uphold Roe v. Wade, things like that. So I think that's interesting to see how this will play out. Part of it is that because the unaffiliated tend to be younger, they are less likely to vote to begin with now. Bernie aside, I should say. But that really motivated them. Bernie Sanders really motivated a lot of what I suspect were non-believing. I mean, he himself strikes me as a secular humanist. I know he's culturally Jewish, but he doesn't seem to care that much about religion. And I feel like there was something in his message that really motivated people, and that one thing I think the secular movement is sometimes missing is these sort of charismatic leaders. People who really call you to be your best self, who call you to donate your time, and you feel so moved by their presence and them as a role model that you will do it. So I think he's an interesting example of what could motivate these non-religious people to the polls. We'll see if Hillary can do it.
Did you have a question?
This is not, I don't think, in the realm of politics, but if you talk about alternative motivations, for me, I call myself a Tysonist, and my prophet is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh, there you go.
And you mentioned Lawrence Krauss.
Yeah.
What do you think about these guys? As to me, they're the magic of science and so forth is certainly a alternative motivation.
I think they're amazing, and I think they do a wonderful job of popularizing science and making it really accessible. And also, Krauss talks about wonder. He talks about the poetry of the fact that we're all made of stardust. We all share these atoms of stars. which is kind of incredible. So I think they're really wonderful, and I think they just maybe don't reach as wide an audience. But I will say that a lot of people I met as I was researching this book, when I asked, so when you started to lose religion, what did you turn to? And a lot of them said Richard Dawkins. I mean, they read The God Delusion. They read all of these books. And that was a way for them to finally hear someone say what they had long believed but didn't know how to articulate quite as clearly. And so I think these people have been wonderful for that. And I think, maybe some women would be good in that space too, and maybe some people, maybe it's poets or maybe it's artists, just to sort of diversify it a bit. But you see someone like Pope Francis, who has captured the hearts of the world, and you wonder, who would that be for us? And I'm not sure that we have that yet, but people seem to really connect with him. And so who is that big leader? I'm not sure.
I saw a hand back here.
If we're talking about meaning, and the biggest meaning of all, eternal afterlife, look at all the millions and billions of years involved there, and plus you're up there with your family and friends, happy, enjoy forever seeing God and thinking about God forever. How could you get more meaning than that? That's the greatest meaning, but of course it has to be verified, but so don't we always, if these messages and stories of Abrahamic religions, and some Eastern ones too, are true, don't you always have to keep the God question alive? No, don't you always have to consider whether or not God does exist and whether it could be rationally argued for? Can there be a rational faith? Do you think we should keep the question of God's real existence always thinking about it?
Yeah. So I describe myself as an agnostic, and it's because I honestly think I don't know, and I'm not going to know while I am living in this human body with this human brain, and that maybe something will surprise me after I die. But I'm really comfortable and open, as you say, to the uncertainty of that, and just to, I can't really organize my life around belief in God if I don't believe with some, real certainty or strength that he's there. So I live a human life and try to do my best among humanity. Yeah.
We have a question up front.
Thank you. What would you say to the idea that the first three words of the Bible in the beginning are a human idea in the light that there are billions and billions of stars and planets, billions of light years away? The Hubble telescope has revealed that the universe seems to be boundless, and in time and in space, and perhaps there was no beginning at all.
Okay, that's a very deep question. I will add, I do want to add that it's interesting to me because on measures of religious literacy, the people who know the most about religion, and clearly this group knows a lot about the sacred text, are atheists. And so they score really high on this stuff because of they're thinking about these things a lot. So Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, and I would recommend it to people who are curious about this question of where it all began. Like my daughter asked, who were the parents of the first people? Where did it begin? I think it's something that there's a lot of literature on.
Thank you for coming and talking to us. I would like to ask you if you could elaborate on the word spiritual, the use and meaning. You made a brief comment that it's a difficult word, probably for a lot of people in this room as well. I think it's an important one. You seem to want to redefine the word, but I think that I would lean towards trying to define what we're really talking about and finding the correct words for it. So thank you.
So I found meaning from the word awe. Awe might be a better way to describe it because of the science on awe now and how they demonstrate that it's this sort of change that comes over our central nervous system, basically. It slows down time. It makes us feel more calm and therefore charitable and compassionate. And so part of that process is feeling connected to this larger system, be it the Grand Canyon or rubbing my daughter's back. And so spiritual, I think, to be a spiritual person, and I don't use that because I think it is misunderstood so often, but in this sort of secular spiritual definition that I came to discover in conversation with this one professor, I recognized that it can be used in a secular way, and that it means to feel that connection to this larger thing, and that, once you start maybe not thinking about the word spiritual, but these connections and awe and wonder, you start to notice it more often, and I think that increases meaning and a feeling of connection.
Did your son ever ask you any questions about religion before he started a procession going to the Greek Orthodox Church?
Not necessarily specifically, but my kids have all asked me things like, what happens when we die? They've asked me the questions that religion has long been in the business of answering. Questions about why we're here. Even, my daughter once said, is dying like when you go in the river and then you just float away? Things like that. They always have these sort of little sayings and questions and reflections that were related to the questions religion often can give you answers for. And so I think my challenge was really, how can I come up with my own set of answers that aren't based in religion?
Hi, thank you for coming today.
Sure, thanks.
I have a question. We've talked a lot about atheists on the one end of the scale and the religious and very religious on the other end. But I, like you, consider myself to be agnostic. And I wonder if you have done any studies or spoken with people and have drawn any conclusions about people who are agnostic having more, perhaps, joy in their life because they don't know. And so they want to peel back the layers on the onion, as it were, of the different aspects of life and faith, and are more open, perhaps, to the awe and the wonderment of life and beyond around us.
So the one woman that I did talk with was a professor at Boston University who studies the atheist mind, and she was the one who talked about the spectrum. And it was really interesting, her presentation. She talked about how on the one end, the believers are much more likely to also be people who have this sort of more, when they're thinking about things and making decisions about something, they're given a bunch of information to make a decision, they're more likely to go with their gut feeling. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you have the engineers, right? The people who are like, I really need to work this out logically. I want to take apart the pieces, and I'm going to figure out what it is. And then somewhere in between are other people. So I don't know where agnostics would fit on that spectrum, but that we all have a way of making sense of the world. And it often mimics, and interestingly, women who are more likely to have this sort of sense of understanding others. That's another component of the religious mindset. We can often intuit the feelings of others, and we have a sense of theory of mind, they call it, tend to be more religious, tend to more likely believe in God. And then there's people at the very far end of this spectrum are autistic people who can only see things in this logical breakdown. And so I had this one experience with my kids, because I have an atheist and I have I have an atheist son and a spiritual daughter. And we were in the car, and it was really snowy outside and freezing. And my daughter just started saying, oh, it's such a beautiful sunny day. It's so lovely out. And my son said, you're just talking nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. And it doesn't make any sense at all. And how can you say that? And he got really mad. And I thought, here we have two people on this spectrum where she's really just going out there. She wants to imagine this other thing. And he really wants evidence for it. And if there's not evidence, he just thinks it's silly to discuss. So these are sort of caricatures, of course. But I thought that research, her name is Katherine Harris, and she studies the atheist mind. She doesn't have a book out right now, but I think eventually she will, was really interesting. And maybe there is a book called The Agnostic Manifesto that just came out in the past year that you might check out. I haven't read it. It's by Leslie Hazelton. And she talks about living in uncertainty and how it's the only place for her.
Hi. I feel sorry that I missed first portion of your talk, but I actually have two questions. First, because you're saying that you have two kids, how do humanists celebrate, because we don't have specific festivals or such, right? Mm-hmm. In South Asia, we do celebrate a lot of festivals. Mm-hmm. As humanists, how do we teach our kids the celebrations? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, U.S. and most of the European countries are much liberal when it comes to atheists or humanists. But back in South Asian countries, we have seen situation changing very drastically bad. Mm-hmm. People are being killed and all that. So how do we see things changing there, or what can we expect, or what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. I think in some countries you do see a more conservative side rising. I think in fear, really, of the changes going on in the modern world and changing positions of women, for example. And so you see atheists, killed and really horrible things happening. I don't know what the answer is. I think, Obama always cites that quote that it's a long haul, but the earth bends. We bend toward justice. I mean, hopefully, as information disseminates at a more rapid pace through the internet, people are exposed to more ideas. They start to see, well, my idea can't be the only one if all these other people have a God too. I don't know that there's a concrete solution I can offer. But in terms of the holidays, I visited a lot of groups who were having their own holidays, and sometimes it's a reclaiming of a religious holiday and making it their own. So this is Rosh Hashanah, and my one woman I interviewed who did not want to pay the high price of high holiday services anymore. She was raised Jewish, and she said she didn't even understand what they were saying anyway. And she had recently learned that there's a saying in part of the Torah that instructs men to wake up every morning and thank God they aren't women. And so she decided, enough with this traditional Judaism stuff, but I care about the culture and I want my kids to feel Jewish. And so on Rosh Hashanah, which is a time of reflection from the previous year and celebration of the new year, a celebration of the circle of life, she took her kids on a bike ride around Central Square, and they went to the carousel, and they rode around the carousel. They went home, and they had their circular challah bread, and they sat around the table and talked about what regrets they had and what hopes they had for the new year. And so she was able to keep this Jewish tradition alive, but on terms that sat well with her. So I found a lot of examples of that. And then, of course, there's lots of people pulling back some of the pagan rituals. Solstice parties are really a big thing now. People are, I visited a secular winter solstice celebration in New York City where hundreds of people came and lit candles and really celebrated the coming of the light and the earth and nature. And so I think that's just requires some creativity, but it can actually be kind of fun.
One last question.
Hi, thank you for being here. I consider myself an absolute atheist. I have a two-part question. If a being from the sky descended and it happened just like the Bible explains that it'll happen, would you believe in God?
If the sky descended?
If exactly what the Bible happened, let's say Jesus came down, would you then believe in God?
Well, I guess if I could verify that it was Jesus.
Okay.
How do I know it's Jesus?
You actually kind of answered the second question because I was going to ask, would you then consider that maybe it's just another being from another planet in the universe?
Right. Yeah. No, I think I will probably be an agnostic until I die, and then I'll figure it out. Because of this human brain problem.
I think that's the end of our Q&A, but we do have actually a point of clarification about what this group does for humanist celebrations.
So I've been in ethical humanism since I was born. So actually, I never wanted to believe because my parents were humanists. Yeah. But I just wanted to mention that if you're not familiar with our organization, we do a lot of different ceremonies for the seasons. We have a spring festival, a winter festival, where we talk about the changing of the seasons and what happens in the world. Our Sunday school kids are educated on all major religions. So that, if you go to school with someone who's Catholic or who's Jewish, you understand more, what are they doing. We also have a coming-of-age ceremony for kids when they're in sort of junior high, and it's sort of an entry into the world of social service and humanism and adulthood. So we do have a lot of celebrations and rituals. And you can ask more about it today in the newcomers meeting if you like.
Great, thank you. So I'll be making some announcements shortly, but let's give a round of applause and thank our